my so there are a number of opportunities I just want to highlight, and the first one, and the one that is actually most ready to go, is a program that is fully online, self-directed, self-paced. It's called Caregiving During Crisis. We started, a team of us started working on this almost a year ago, recognizing that family caregivers already have a tough job, but once the pandemic hit, that job just became much, much more difficult. They had at the very least, to worry about how to keep their person and themselves safe in a world where there's now this surround of a COVID-19 pandemic. And so we wanted to put together something that would help to understand what COVID is, how it's transmitted, and how to protect yourself and the person for whom you care from COVID. So there's a whole segment on maintaining a safe home. But then when you begin to see reports coming out about people going to the emergency room or going to the hospital or having telemedicine visits, it's hard enough for us as individuals to think about managing that, but for a caregiver to think about navigating the healthcare system on behalf of a person who's living with dementia, you begin to understand this is a really complex task. And so there's a whole section of this course that describes the geography of the healthcare system, all of the players, the roles that they play in healthcare, the different pathways that people take through the healthcare system, and in particular describe a strategy for communicating with healthcare professionals to be more effective as a communicator. There are also very, very handy kinds of fillable materials for a grab and go package, an information package that you can prepare in advance. Should you ever have to take a person to the emergency room or to a hospital, has all the pertinent information that the healthcare system will need to be able to quickly take the person into the system and to begin care. There's a whole set of information about information you should have about yourself as a caregiver in case something happens to you. Who's going to take over? How will that happen? And then finally, there's a section on managing the care of a person at home with dementia. So this is one course, Caregiving During Crisis. We will begin enrolling people in this course as early as next week, really. And we're looking for at least 100 people, 100 family caregivers to volunteer to be part of it. If you want to be part of it, this is an IRB approved study. We'll go through the informed consent procedure, ask you to do a baseline interview, and then take the course, and then we'll follow up with you on 2 other interviews afterwards. And there's a $25 gift certificate gift card for each interview in which you participate. There's a pilot course on equity and caregiving that's being developed, and this is specifically for members of the LGBTQ community who are themselves caregivers for persons living with dementia. This is a course that's being designed to help those caregivers, again, navigate the system, navigate the complexities of care, providing care in a system that sometimes throws up barriers and is often fraught with stigma for those caregivers. We will, in a couple of months, be enrolling people in a Telesavvy at Home program. Again, this will be a fully online, self-paced course in home-based caregiving for a person living with dementia. It is a course that includes a lot of video materials, and it's done at your convenience. The idea behind this is that being a caregiver for someone with a dementia illness is a skilled task and requires the acquisition of knowledge, skills, and also the development of a sense of confidence and competence to be able to do this. This is a program that is based on one that we've tested in an online synchronous and asynchronous version. It's proved very successful. Now we're doing it in a fully asynchronous way. In other words, there'll be no group meetings, it'll be totally self-administered. And finally, we're also working on something called the CARE course. This is a course specifically for African-American family caregivers. It looks a bit like the caregiving during crisis, but with a particular emphasis on navigating all of the healthcare and community systems with which caregivers have to interact and communicate with and advocate within on behalf of a person living with dementia. So these are just 4 of the things we're doing at the ADRC. And this is the critical email address, lie.read@emory.edu. Lie can answer questions about each of these, can help you get additional information, will point you in the direction of the specific investigators who are working on these programs. And in the case of caregiving during crisis, can actually enroll you in courses as early as next week. So I just want to finish out by saying these are just 4 of the caregiver programs available at the ADRC. And I hope that you will raise questions about them and speak with Lai and contact Lai for further information.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hepburn. And will you spell out her contact information? I think we have like 9 individuals that have called in.
So it's all lowercase, LAI dot REED @ Emory, EMORY .edu.
Excellent. And when we launch the pre-poll during every program, we're averaging about 27 respondents that say they are caregivers of people living with memory loss. So that's why it's so critical to have programs just like this. Okay, we are going to turn it over to Dr. Bert Anderson. Welcome, Dr. Anderson. I'm going to make you a co-host so that you can share your screen. Welcome back. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you guys so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Let me go ahead and see if I can share my screen here. Let's see. All right. Can you see my slides?
Looks great.
Okay. Well, thank you, Cornelia, and the other folks who organized this. My name is Bert Anderson, and I am in the Department of Medicine, Division of Infectious Diseases at Emory. And so I'm kind of circling back to the group. We gave a brief overview a few months ago, so we wanted to kind of circle back and see if there are any questions, also to make sure that we get the word out about this study that we're doing. So we're doing a study with a virtual reality device. So I'm going to go ahead and advance here. Whoops. Stop share. Oh, okay, maybe it's here. There we go. So no disclosures to report today. So just to review a little bit about HIV-associated memory loss and cognition. So the dementia that's associated with HIV has declined significantly with our effective treatments, antiretroviral therapy. So we're really happy about that. And we feel that we've been able to get dementia under control with HIV, except for those cases where people are not on medications. However, people with HIV are still at risk for having mild cognitive impairment, not to the point that they're demented, but enough that they have trouble sometimes with organizational skills and other activities of daily living, enough that it can affect their lives. And so it is now kind of an umbrella term, what we call HIV-associated neurocognitive disorder, or HAND. So HAND is still common, although the dementia form of HAND is not common anymore. The HAND that includes the more minor cognitive problems is very common. And several studies have shown that it's up to 25 to 40% of people with HIV who are on antiretroviral therapy. So we know that it's a problem and it needs further research. And there are a few different clinical implications for folks with HAND. So it's been associated with decreased quality of life. And sometimes people have trouble remembering their medication or keeping track of their medication. And that's a big problem in people with HIV, because if people are not taking their medications correctly, sometimes the virus can really spin out of control. And that's when we run into a lot more problems in people with HIV having uncontrolled infection. And it's certainly been associated with increased mortality. So people who have HAND, there's been at least a couple studies have shown that those people are higher risk for premature mortality. So one of the problems with HAND is that it's not easy to diagnose in most clinic settings. So to make the diagnosis, technically you need to administer a battery of neuropsychological tests. So as many on the call are very familiar with, these are kind of paper and pencil tests that have been around for many decades. But in order to do them, you have to have someone who is experienced. And then of course, a lot goes into the scoring. So it takes a lot of time. Most HIV clinics do not have access to neuropsych testing. So we need more rapid tests that are automated, that are easy to administer, where we can detect HAND, problems with cognition, without having to do full neuropsychological testing. And so that's what we're studying. So the device that we've been studying for a while now is called the Display Enhanced Testing for Cognitive Impairment and Traumatic Brain Injury. And so the acronym for this is the DETECT device. So the DETECT device was developed in a joint collaboration between Emory and Georgia Tech. And it's been validated for detecting cognitive impairment in older adults, as well as in certain sports settings, such as settings in which people have repetitive head trauma. So we've looked at it in HIV, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But the main reason I'm here is to just kind of get the word out a little bit more about a larger study that we're doing that includes people with HIV and then without HIV. So that's the group we're really trying to reach, is people who don't have HIV, who kind of have the mild cognitive impairment that is often the early stages of Alzheimer's. So these are just some pictures of the DETECT. So up on the right, top right-hand corner, you see kind of the older version. And again, this is the population that it was studied in football players, where it was kind of this bulky helmet that people had to wear, and then also a keyboard with it. And so if you look down here on the left, bottom left-hand corner, it has now been streamlined. So the program can be put on a smartphone, and then it can be worn as a virtual reality headset. And so it's got that capability where it feels like, it feels like real life. It's a virtual reality environment now with the DETECT. And so that's the version that we're studying now. Just to give you a sense of the device, what does it test? Well, it tests learning. So people are shown, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but it's shown a list of words to learn. Then there are shapes, basically, where there's a figure presented and then subsequent figures presented after that to see if people can remember that original figure and to tell us if the new one that they're seeing is the exact same figure. There's an arrow test, which basically tests people's orientation and their executive function. It tests them if they're able to learn a task and then point arrows in the correct direction. There's a face test, basically, where people are shown some faces and they're asked to remember them. There's a feature where it goes face one back that they're supposed to remember. And there's a little bit more difficult one where people have to remember a face that was two back from the face that they're being shown. And then it comes back to the words that were first taught to the person to see how good their memory is with the word learning. So just to give you the sense of the study that we did in people with HIV, this was a few years ago where we enrolled about 40 people with HIV who then took the DETECT, and then it was compared against the standard neuropsychological testing panel. So these were certainly younger people than what we're looking for now. These were people kind of in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and most of whom were on antiretroviral therapy. So these are people that shouldn't become demented, but could have some more mild cognitive impairment. And so this is one of the plots that shows the results. So basically on the y-axis, you have their standard neuropsychological test score. And then the x-axis down here is where they were tested with the DETECT. So the results on the DETECT and their standard neuropsychological test results correlated very well. So the DETECT seems to really do a good job of replicating some of those tests that we typically see in the old-fashioned neuropsych tests. We then compared it to kind of an older measure of memory in people with HIV, the HIV dementia scale, and found that it actually performed a little bit better than that when compared to the standard neuropsych testing. So that was a study that provided kind of a basis for the larger study that we're doing now. So, and then since then, there have been a couple of additions to the DETECT device. There's now a way that we can measure reaction time with it. There's a target tracking procedure. And then there's this really interesting balance test. So it's sort of a seesaw with the virtual reality that allows us to test balance without actually getting the person up. So sometimes it can be very, very difficult to test balance because you have to get people up. And with the device, we're actually able to get a sense of the person's balance without actually getting them up to stand up. So for our new study, we are looking for folks
Okay, it looks like Dr. Anderson may have lost connection. All right, well, hopefully he will join us back. Dr. Parker, well,
Yes.
Tell us, I guess let's just sort of, dissect a little bit of what Dr. Anderson was talking about in hopes that he rejoins us.
With respect to?
He's looking to distinguish, he has this device and he's sort of trying to streamline early detection for individuals over 60 with mild cognitive impairment. Like we talk about getting diagnosed, but it looks like he is really doing some cutting edge research where you don't have to have the neuropsych testing that we talk about, correct?
Well, I think that he said it's a study, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's trying to make sure that we get all of these sorts of things validated. And I'm going to hope that he gets back up and running so that he can give you more specific details about his particular device.
Okay.
And when it comes to Dr. Anderson, there he is.
I'm back, sorry.
Oh,
So the power went out in our building over here at Grady, so we're kind of trying to find rooms that actually have power.
oh my gosh. Well, take your time. Dr. Parker was just
Can you
sort
hear
of
me?
Yes,
Now we can hear you. Go on.
Okay, finish up real quick here. All right, so to finish up, we're looking for folks who don't have significant comorbidities, people who've had strokes, that would basically confound their diagnosis. We wouldn't be able to attribute it to MCI, people who have other conditions that might contribute to memory problems. So the goals of the study are to better understand differences between people with hand and HIV negatives who have MCI, and to track that cognition over time to see if the device can predict a decline in terms of.
So how is Georgia MemoryNet going? Are we up and
So the study is observational, and one of the reasons why I'm coming back is to make sure people understand that there are no medications involved. There's no lumbar puncture involved. I know there are a lot of studies that are out there that are great studies, obviously, but there are a lot of people who don't necessarily want to take new medications or have lumbar puncture. And so this would be a potential study for those folks. People have visits every 6 months for a total of 2 years. And the visits include neuropsych testing, testing with the detect device. We do draw some blood, and then there's also a hearing test. People are reimbursed for their participation in the study. And again, we've got the HIV positives pretty much covered. It's just the folks that are HIV negative that we really, really need, who have mild cognitive impairment. And those are the folks that we're really interested in recruiting right now. And again, there's no study drug involved, and there's no lumbar puncture involved. And so our contact information is on this last slide. If there are people who are just on audio, I can read out my address and Rebecca's address.
Yes, please.
Okay, so my email address is all lowercase, AA, N as in Nancy, D as in dog, E as in Edgar, 2 at emory.edu. And then our study coordinator is named Rebecca Taylor. And her email address is Rebecca, this is all lowercase, and Rebecca is spelled REBEKAH .Taylor, TAYLOR at emory.edu. And with that, thank you guys so much for having me back. And again, if anyone's interested or knows anyone or wants to make a referral, please let us know. And I'll take any questions.
One thing, Dr. Anderson, do they have to have the mild cognitive impairment diagnosis?
Well, they don't have to, but if they do not, then we'd like to hear from people who are starting to experience some symptoms.
Okay.
So if you are if say you're not having any symptoms at all, you're over the age of 60, you're not having any symptoms at all, we're happy to have you in for a screening visit, because it might be that you might have some mild impairment. But we're mostly looking for people who started to notice some change in that. Yeah.
And they need to come where? And I do remember you saying they need to be over 60, correct?
Yes, so we're looking for folks age 60 and up. And if you're interested, please give us a call. My phone number's on here. It's 404-895-6030. And Rebecca is 404-251-5366. So please reach out to us by phone or email, and we'd love to have you in for a screening visit.
And so other than that baseline data, it's every 6 months over 2 years. And you said observational. What does that mean?
Okay, I'm sorry, that's kind of research jargon. So that basically means that we're not giving any kind of intervention. We are not giving new medications. We're not doing new therapies. It's basically just following folks over time. So that's all observational means.
Okay. Ms. Rosalind, did you have a question? You can post it in the chat or in the Q&A. And Crystal has put the all this contact information. So let's overwhelm Ms. Reed with Dr. Hepburn and Ms. Taylor. They are the coordinators for our respective scientists. We want to flood them with interest, because research is really an opportunity to better understand memory impairment, and also to have a front row seat actually when it comes to research intervention. So thank you again, Dr. Anderson. We're going to turn it over to Dr. Monica Parker, who's going to share with us again, what is ApoE? And just tell us about some of the genetic, we've been featuring biomarkers and our other clinicians, but we hear the term all the time, ApoE. What is that?
Okay, so when we start talking about Alzheimer's, a lot of Alzheimer's comes because you've inherited certain genes. Now, there are more than 30 different genes that have been identified as associated with Alzheimer's and related dementias, or Alzheimer's specifically. But the gene that has been most commonly studied and best studied and most publicized is something called ApoE4, apolipoprotein E4 allele. It's on the E4 allele. So if you have inherited the gene for Alzheimer's, chances are you have 2 copies of this E4 gene. E4, or E4, E3, maybe E2, E4. But in any event, E4, apolipoprotein E4 allele, is a gene that's most commonly associated with Alzheimer's. That being said, one of the, it's not really used diagnostically, but the idea is that if you have a copy of the ApoE4 gene, you are at higher risk and more likely to develop Alzheimer's dementia or disease. As science progresses, just because you have this gene, we're learning that there are certain things that turn on the gene that may turn on what we call the Alzheimer's cascade. Just because it's a part of your genetics doesn't mean that those genes need to be turned on and express the diseases that they're associated with. That's why we talk a lot about lifestyles and other things to manage certain things. Certain types of dementia are carried on genes for which there is a mutation, which means that you didn't necessarily inherit it from your mother or father. It just mutated and there it is. So again, just to get into the genetics of Alzheimer's disease in particular, there are many genes that are associated with Alzheimer's. The most commonly described or most commonly worked on or investigated has been something called apolipoprotein E4. And if you have 2 copies of this gene, apolipoprotein E4, both E4s, you are more likely to have or develop Alzheimer's disease in particular. I won't go into the other genes simply because those aren't really germane to our discussion, but when we start talking about inheritance, that is one of the genes that we're looking at, ApoE4. And a lot of you may have bought into 23andMe or Ancestry.com and found out that you carry this gene. And so you want to know, well, what's my risk for getting Alzheimer's? Well, the answer is we're not really sure how that plays in, because there are other things that go into giving you or making or contribute to the development of Alzheimer's, dementia, and maybe even other dementias. So that's why we want you to have a comprehensive examination and look at you in total before we can prescribe risks. If you want to know more about whether or not you have this gene or any other gene that's associated with a specific disease process, as in breast cancer, if you have a BRCA1 gene, BRCA2 gene, those are genes. You can go to a geneticist and get that kind of an assessment. You can order kits, but just because you order these kits, there's not necessarily an explanation that can calculate and tell you what your risk is for this, whatever the disease is that you're looking for. That being said, I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Hoos. And I'm sorry if I butchered her name. We went over this ahead of time, and I'm not sure that I got it completely correct. But she's going to talk to you about what we're learning about prevention, disease prevention, Alzheimer's prevention, and share with you some of her work. Dr. Hoos? I'm going to say it wrong. Just say it so that we all get it correct.
Very close. Hoots. Was close enough. Thanks a lot. Okay, let me share my screen. All right. Yeah, so thanks a lot for having me and giving me the opportunity to share some of my recent research with you. So I joined the Rowland School of Public Health at Emory University a little bit more than, almost 1.5 years ago now. So in January 2020. And since then, I have been involved in a few projects related to the health effects of air pollution and dementia. And so I would like to share with you some of my recent findings and also give you a general overview about the question, does the air we breathe affect our risk for dementia? So in general, our health is strongly influenced by the air we breathe. And fine particle air pollution comes from many different sources. So including vehicle emissions, coal burning, power plants, industrial emissions, and many other human and also natural sources. And of course, the most well studied health effects of air pollution are respiratory health, so impaired lung function, and also cardiovascular effects of air pollution have been studied for many decades. And but in the last about 20 years already, interest in the possible effects of air pollution on the brain has really begun and now has been studied over and over again in many different settings. So the first report of this association was published in 2002. And in 2002, Calderon Garciduenas et al. Published a report from Mexico City in which they found that dogs living on the streets in Mexico City and were, of course, exposed to really high levels of air pollution, that these dogs showed neuropathological changes which are related to dementia. So, and they even found air pollution particles in the brain of these dogs. And also other studies, for example, using data from brain banks, so human tissue, have also shown that these fine particles and especially nanoparticles, so these really fine air pollutants, are able to enter your brain. So they are so small that they can cross the blood-brain barrier, and they are able to enter the brain and cause damage in the brain. And more recently, interest in possible effects of air pollution on the brain has been strengthened by epidemiological studies. So that means, epidemiological studies are basically large-scale studies in which we usually, most of them include healthy individuals. So for example, like the Emory Healthy Aging study, in which people from the general population are invited to join an epidemiological studies. They are asked about social risk factors, about demographics, and all these kind of things. And of course, also about health outcomes at several time points. And using this kind of study design, so epidemiological studies, several studies have already shown in the last decades that there is a very robust association between air pollution and cognitive decline and dementia. However, there are a few things that are not well understood yet. So, and these are some questions that I'm addressing in my current research projects. So the first study I will briefly talk about is a project which is funded by the Hercules Center at Emory. And in this study, we are investigating the effects of air pollution on cognitive decline, and in particular, what's the impact of living in a disadvantaged neighborhood on this association. So questions like, do people who live in disadvantaged neighborhoods in Atlanta, are they more vulnerable to the effects of air pollution? Is it more likely that these people develop dementia after being exposed to high levels of air pollution? And the other question that I'm addressing in my research is to learn a little bit more about the biological response to air pollution. So what we are doing here is, and I will talk more about that in a second, so we use data from the ADSC brain banks, and we analyze associations between exposure to air pollution, so based on the participants' last address before they died, in association with neuropathology in their brains. And we will also look at metabolomics and epigenomics to really get an idea how air pollution affects our brain and what exactly it does, and which biological pathways are influenced by air pollution in our brain. So the first study I want to talk about is based on the Emory Healthy Aging study. And here we focused on the baseline visit of the study, and we included about 12,000 participants aged 50 years and older from the Metro Atlanta area. And the health outcome we looked at was the cognitive function instrument. And this is a measurement which helps us to measure subjectively measure cognitive change over the past year. And we looked at air pollution exposure at the participants' addresses. So we simply linked the participants' addresses. So we have access to the participants' addresses, and then we estimated the average air pollution exposure at that particular place in Metro Atlanta. And then, as I said, we were interested in looking into effect modifications by living in disadvantaged neighborhoods. So what we did is that we downloaded data from the US Census Bureau on socioeconomic status. And then we conducted some clustering to combine all this information into just a few variables. I will not go into detail here, but basically the variables that we calculated reflect poverty, income, racial composition, education, employment, occupation, and housing properties in the neighborhoods where the participants lived. And so these are the results of our first analysis. And Zhen Zheng is the doctoral student who has been working on this project. And so I will not go into too much detail here, but so basically this is a statistical analysis for the association between exposure to air pollution, so based on where the participants lived, in association with cognitive functioning. And when we first started with this project, so these basically what you do in these epidemiological analysis is that you always have to adjust for confounding. So that means that basically you have to control for other factors that could influence the air pollution level in the neighborhood and also the outcome. So in these first models, we only included individual study characteristics. So we only included age and education and income and these kind of things, and also race. But and what we saw was that surprisingly, we saw protective effects of air pollution on cognitive functioning, which is obviously not very plausible. And that was actually a sign that there must be more going on. It seems like we do not control for all the bias that is there in this kind of data. And that's why we started including neighborhood characteristics. And what we then saw is that especially participants who lived in more disadvantaged neighborhoods. So for example, here in cluster 6 and cluster 7, if we have a closer look here, so cluster 7, particularly the immigrant communities around Beaufort Highway, and also mainly Black neighborhoods in the southern part of Atlanta. And so these communities were characterized by low income. These were low income communities. And what we found is that participants living in these neighborhoods, we really saw an effect of air pollution on cognitive functioning. So, so people who were already were already disadvantaged because of the neighborhood they lived in, they also were more vulnerable to the effects of air pollution, which is of course a very important message, especially in the context of environmental injustice, because these areas are usually the areas that also have the higher air pollution concentrations. And then the next step that we did was to really look at the joint effects of neighborhood characteristics, which are kind of a proxy for social stressors and air pollution. And my other doctoral student, Grace, she's a PhD student in the epidemiology program at Rollins. And what she did was that so this is a mixture analysis, and I just want to briefly tell you a little bit about what she found. So basically, the Metro Atlanta area was again divided into different clusters based on the different exposures, so the neighborhood characteristics and the air pollutants. And so cluster 4 is in this case characterized by, it's a high SES, so high income community, and also low levels of air pollution. And when we compare the other clusters to this cluster, we can see that the other clusters had on average, so after adjusting for age, education, and so on, had lower cognitive function than participants living in this cluster. And what was also interesting is that when we look, for example, at cluster 1 and also cluster 5, we can see that these clusters these are still high income communities, but they have higher levels of air pollution than people living in cluster 4. And what we can see here is that that we see significant differences in cognitive function in comparison to cluster 4, but basically the cognitive function was still better than in clusters like these, so clusters 2 and 3, which were again participants being exposed to high levels of air pollution, but also suffering from many social risk factors based on these neighborhood characteristics. And so these are again the clusters that I showed you previously, so the one around Beaufort Highway and also the southern part of downtown Atlanta. So just to sum up, so what we found is that it is really important to consider neighborhood characteristics as a confounder and effect modifier when we investigate associations between air pollution and cognitive function. And so neighborhood characteristics and long-term exposure to air pollution could have a joint impact on cognitive function, and participants living in disadvantaged neighborhoods might be more susceptible to ambient air pollution. And examining both neighborhood features and environmental pollutants, as well as their interaction, may offer important implication for the identification of health disparities in the context of environmental injustice. So then the next step as I mentioned, is that we really want to look into the biological response of the brain to air pollution. So here we use data from the ADRC Brain Bank. And so we included participants from the Metro Atlanta area. And the study is based on individuals who have died after 2008. And again, we focused on older individuals, so here above the age of 55. And the sample size was 145. And again, we assigned air pollution exposures based on the last address before they died. And the outcome here was different markers for neuropathology. So we used the Braak stage, SERAD, and also the ABC score. And we also had information on different covariates that were important, again, to consider to avoid any bias for the association. And what we found is that, interestingly, we found again an association between in this case, PM2.5 and Braak stage, which means that participants who lived in more polluted areas, so with high PM2.5 concentrations, they were more likely to have a higher Braak stage, which means higher levels of neuropathology. And so we did not find any significant association with SERAD and APC, although these are odds ratios, so that means that any odds ratios above 1 indicates a positive association. So the direction of effect was the same for SERAD and ABC, but it was only significant for the Braak stage. And which is interesting because Braak staging is the neuropathology marker showing the strongest association with cognitive performance and decline. So these findings could have implication for both Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease-related dementias. And so moving forward, we are now in the process of measuring metabolomics and also DNA methylation in brain tissue of these about 160 donors from the ADRC Brain Bank. And I hope that in the next months or year, I will be able to tell you a little bit more about the biological mechanisms that are behind these associations that we found. So just to sum up, we found in our project significant associations between air pollution and dementia-related outcomes, so cognitive functioning and also neuropathology among participants of the Emory Healthy Aging Study and the ADRC Brain Bank living in Metro Atlanta. And associations seem to be stronger among participants living in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And we found strong interactions and joint effects of environmental and social risk factors. And with that, I would like to thank especially my lab members who did most of the work I presented, and of course, my collaborators. And thank you for your attention.
Dr. Huls, thank you so much for coming and sharing this information with us. Can you help us with disadvantaged neighborhoods in Metro Atlanta? What are you describing, or how are you defining a disadvantaged neighborhood? I know we don't have much time, but that's real important.
Yeah, so we use data from the US Census Bureau. So that was based on the average income level in the census tract, the average education level in the census tract, and rate of unemployment, household value, all these kind of information that we had access to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to leave, but my parting shot will be that for those of us who have well-engaged dementia and other disorders, we do want to have your brain, if you no longer have use of it, through our autopsy program. And through our autopsy program, you enter that by becoming a part of our longitudinal research registry called the Memory Study. And Crystal will put that in the chat. But we want your brains if you no longer need it. But in order to leave it to us, we really do need to get you in our research registry if you are so interested. Are genetic visits covered by Medicare? The answer to that question is no. Generally, they are not. So I see Matt Doran on there to give a plug for our cognitive empowerment program. Thank you all so much for participating this week. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Hey everyone, just really quickly, today we're going to be doing a workout with our physical therapist, Tony. And so if you'd like to get in an extra workout today, please come see us. I'm going to post the link to our to register for our webinar coming up in a minute right now. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, we will see you all back here next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. 2 p.m. Eastern. That was just a time change because of our virtual 20th forum, but we are returning to our 2 p.m. Eastern time slot. And again, be on the lookout for a link to today's video. We'll see you back next week. Goodbye.